Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of The Dice Society. In case you're joining me for the first time, my name is Caio, and I'm the author of thedicesociety.com. This is a podcast about the MCDM RPG, where I talk about its development, my playtest experience, and, once the time is right, first and third-party content being made for the game. Today's topic is hot off the presses. At the time of recording, James and Matt have just announced on the MCDM Patreon a new core mechanic for the game. It's called the Power Roll. As usual, everything we're going to talk about is subject to and probably will change. But this new rule is so interesting and so telling about the devs' philosophy that I just couldn't wait to share it with you guys. So, first we'll start with some short news, then go on to the main topic, finishing off with a question from someone in our YouTube channel. Cool? Cool. Let's draw steel and get started. First off, sorry for taking so long to come back. I know it's been a full month, but the truth is, February just didn't have as many updates from the devs. MCDM is hard at work and everyone is apparently swamped with meetings, to the point that James, the lead designer, went almost a full month without streaming a single time. As for the news, we have some minor updates that are currently being tested by MCDM's playtest coordinators. These are changes motivated by the feedback from the Patreon playtest packet, more on that in a minute, and apply to many different aspects of the game. These changes include new negotiation rules, which are much simpler and flexible, making them easier to use while improvising at the table. They also completely threw out the endurance characteristic, which is their analog for a character's constitution ability score from 5e. They claimed its only use was determining HP, which is now directly tied to your class and kit, no weird middleman necessary. They are even prototyping a new elementalist class, where each of the 7 elements, not 4, does something different besides just damage. For example, fire can push people around, water can change things, and etc. And we even got some art previews. In a recent Twitch stream, Matt showed us the drafts for the Memenek art. They are a timescape ancestry whose bodies are made of porcelain and glass. Really cool and inspiring. As for IRL news, the team is considering going to Gen Con this year. Nothing formally announced yet, so curb your enthusiasm. And this is it for this month's summary. By the way, if you're interested in more news, I strongly recommend you listen to our sister podcast, Goblin Points. Every month they release a new episode covering everything MCDM related, including the RPG. In the last couple of episodes, they even give an overview of every single little change that the devs have talked about. I'll leave a link to the website on this episode's description. Make sure to check them out. So, housekeeping and news done. We can now move on to the Power Roll, the latest and greatest new mechanic that the devs have cooked up for us. Let's start off with a short retrospective about what the core resolution mechanic of the MCDM RPG was. Back in the Patreon playtest packet, you rolled 2d6 plus a characteristic, equivalent to ability modifiers in D&D. Your tests were 2d6 plus the relevant characteristic, your resistance rolls were 2d6 plus the indicated characteristic, and your attacks were 2d6 plus the relevant characteristic plus a modifier coming from your kit. Now, if you're used to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you might think there is nothing wrong with this, because that game uses the d20 basically in the same way. But remember, the MCDM RPG does not have a 2-hit roll, so your attack is your damage. This means that attacks start to feel very samey after a while. There were ways to add variability into the damage through conditional boons and banes, which are d4s that you add to or subtract from a roll, and impact dice, d8s, which were added by stronger abilities for an extra oomph of damage. At high levels, all of your abilities might have 1 or 2 impact dice in order for damage not to feel too samey. At first level, however, when most people are getting to know the game, damage was very similar across the board because 2d6 was the lowest base damage you could have in the system. Both little kobolds and the heroes were doing 2d6 plus something damage, which became cognitively dissonant if you thought about it too hard. This was mentioned in the Patreon playtest feedback by many people, in addition to the feedback they already had been receiving from their own playtest coordinators. As James and Matt have said, the feedback doesn't dictate design, but informs it. This means that they use feedback to check if the game is achieving its goals, not to set the goals. In this case, they thought that low variability in damage at low levels was detrimental to the game. The team seems to have struggled with this problem for a while, and they tried many different solutions that ended up being scrapped because they failed in some way or another. Back in episode 2 of the Die Society, I even alluded to this when I said that they were trying to use D&D-like damage, where you rolled D4s, D6s, and D8s depending on your kit or your weapon. In the end, the solution was what became known as the power roll. So what the heck is a power roll? You'd be glad to hear that it is still 2d6 plus a relevant characteristic. Now, you didn't mishear anything, I'm being totally serious. The power roll is still 2d6 plus a relevant characteristic. But, and this is a big but, it is only a way for you to look up the true outcome of your action. Before I go on, remember that this is all temporary and that it is still being tested as we speak. Matt has said that they were committed to making power rolls work, but the math, the implementation, the presentation, basically every single aspect of this mechanic is still up for debate. Anyway, if you have ever played any Powered by the Apocalypse or Forged in the Dark RPGs, you basically already know what power rolls are. If you have ever played Epic Spell Wars of the Battle Wizards, you also basically know what power rolls are. That's because power rolls are not technically new. The team is only using this concept in a novel way. In this system, power rolls basically put your result in one of 3 quote-unquote bins. If your 2d6 plus characteristic was 7 or less, you essentially rolled low. If your result was 8, 9, or 10, you rolled mid. If your result was 11 or higher, you rolled high. Low, mid, and high, by the way, are my terms. They're just meant to help you understand what's happening. Anyway, why would you ever have to know if you rolled low, mid, or high? Because every ability, attack, spell, power, whatever you have, has a different effect depending on whether you rolled low, mid, or high. Let me relay to you an example James gave that helped me understand how it all works. Imagine a talent ability called Concussive Slam. It's a telekinetic power that lets you hurt an enemy with the power of your mind, and it has the following effect line. Roll 2d6 plus reason. 7 or lower, 3 damage. 8 to 10, 5 damage. 11 or higher, 7 damage. So the power roll is essentially the input of a table whose output is how much damage you do. And just to make it clear, this table, 7 or lower, 8 to 10, 11 or higher, is the same for every single roll you make in the entire game. So it basically becomes second nature as you go on playing, and at some point you know this table by heart. Now, before you start thinking that this is a lot of work, think about how spells function in D&D 5e. First, you have to either roll to hit or wait for your opponent to roll a saving throw, and then you can read the text of the spell in order to know how much damage you do and whether or not some effect applies. The power roll system is actually less work than casting a spell in 5e because you can completely skip the first part. And if you have a knack for game design, you might already be thinking of other cool things you can do with power rolls. After the Patreon post explaining the new mechanic, James went to the Discord to share the newest version of Concussive Slam. It now reads, roll 2d6 plus reason, 7 or lower, 2 damage and slide 1. 8 to 10, 6 damage and slide 2. 11 or higher, 9 damage and slide 3. Sliding, as you can probably guess, means that you move the target against their will. In this particular effect, if you roll low, you can only slide them 1 square. If you roll mid, you can slide them 2 squares, and if you roll high, you can slide them 3 squares. So the power roll table is not only for damage, it is also for extra effects. Matt already mentioned having plenty of ideas about what to do with different spells, powers, and attacks. If resistance rolls stay in the game, because James mentioned that they could be going away, a spell could have a higher target number to resist if you roll high. A power that does damage in an area might have a larger radius if you roll high. Magic items might even add a fourth, even higher category that does special stuff depending on the item. Just to make sure everybody is on the same page, let me give you a few examples using 5e rules. Say we're adapting Firebolt to the power roll system. In 5th edition, you roll 1d20 plus your intelligence modifier plus your proficiency bonus in order to know whether you hit, and if you do, then you roll for damage. If 5e worked like the MCDM RPG, Firebolt could say something like roll 1d20 plus int plus proficiency. 10 or lower, 3 fire damage. 11 to 15, 5 fire damage. 16 or higher, 8 fire damage. And what if we wanted to adapt Fireball? In this analogy, it could be roll 1d20 plus int plus proficiency. 10 or lower, 15 fire damage. 11 to 15, 25 fire damage and prone. 16 or higher, 35 fire damage, prone, and burning. My MCDM like Fireball doesn't even need a save DC, as it's all determined by my roll. As you can probably tell, I've only talked about how power rolls relate to vanilla attacks, but they are a core resolution mechanic. How do boons and banes, critical hits, and tests make use of power rolls? First, boons are now called edges, as in I have an edge on this attack. Before, edges and banes were circumstantial d4s, which you added to or subtracted from your core 2d6 and that cancel out 1 to 1. Now they work a lot more like advantage and disadvantage in 5th edition. If you're doing something with an edge, you roll 3d6 and take the highest 2. If you're doing something with a bane, you roll 3d6 and take the lowest 2. In this system, you can also have double edge and double bane. As you can probably tell, in these situations, you roll 4d6 and take the highest or lowest 2 respectively. But beware, you cannot have triple edge or triple bane. This means that if you have an edge and a bane, you roll normally. If you have 2 edges and a bane, you roll with only 1 edge. And if you have 3 edges and a bane, you again roll with only 1 edge, because that would be a regular double edge and a bane. The same is true in reverse if you have more banes than edges. This segues really nicely into the new crit situation. Before, crits happened when you rolled an 11 or 12 in the core 2d6. Now, they only happen on 12s, which means they do happen less often. But given the new rules for edges and banes, your odds of getting a crit actually go way up if you have an edge, and go almost to 1 in 8 if you have a double edge. Despite having changed when criticals happen, they still do the same thing. You get an extra action. Finally, tests also changed with the new power roll. Instead of setting a traditional target number for the difficulty of accomplishing a task, the director now decides whether the test is challenging or severe. If the test is challenging, the player has to roll mid or high in order to accomplish the task. That means rolling 8 or higher on the d6 plus modifier. If the test is severe, then the player must roll high. That means 11 or higher on the 2d6 plus modifier. This is quite a big loss of granularity compared to the previous system, and even more compared to 5th edition. It does, however, allow for what James called beneficial successes and costly failures. Beneficial successes happen when a task is challenging and the player rolls high, that is, one category above what they needed. In this case, not only does the character accomplish the task, they also get something extra. Costly failures happen in the reverse situation, when a task is severe and the player rolls low. Here, not only does the character not accomplish the task, something bad also happens. James mentioned that if the director is at a loss of how to describe a beneficial success, they can simply award the players with a fortune token, which works similarly to inspiration in 5e. Costly failures, on the other hand, could also come with a recharge token for the director, which they can use to recharge monster abilities. But there's not a lot of information available about these tokens yet, so they are probably still in early testing. Phew! That's a lot of new stuff. There were also some additional details and minor mechanics that the team has talked about, but I'm not going to get into those in this episode. In fact, I only wanted to talk about the specifics of power rolls because the team has explicitly said that this is likely to stay in the game. This change, however, tells us a lot, in my opinion, about how the dev team works. Not only are they willing to listen to feedback and make changes to the core mechanics of the game after working on it on and off for basically a year, they are also willing to take risks and introduce concepts that might feel weird to the average Dungeons & Dragons player. This shows that, if nothing else, MCDM is ready to make this game the best that it can possibly be. It's not going to be a D&D clone, it's not going to be rules light as many indie RPGs out there are. It's going to be a heroic, tactical, cinematic, fantasy RPG with its own rules, to be judged by its own merits. As for my impressions, I guess you can probably tell by the tone of this episode. At first, I was really scared when I read the Patreon post, because it looked like the team had added back a 2-hit roll and removed the variability from damage, as now there are only 3 possible values for each attack. However, as I saw people talking on the Discord, and as I watched James on Twitch, it started to become clearer and clearer that this system is so powerful and adds so many cool possibilities to the game that it is probably gonna work for me. So what if Fireball doesn't have 41 possible different damage values? Most of them are so unlikely that they never happen anyway, and the few that do happen often are so close to each other that I can barely tell them apart. It is much cooler if I have 3 very different damage values that also come attached to some extra distinct effects. For now, I'm sold. Let's see how the system evolves and trust that the team is doing the best work that they can. Now, onward to a new section of the podcast. In the last episode, I got a question from @Pau Alemani Alemani. Alemani Alemani? Alemani? I don't know. He says on the YouTube channel, "Great video. Could you give a bit more insight on kits and recoveries? I watched the MCDM videos on them, but would like to know how it was playing it." Starting in reverse order, the last time I saw recoveries, they basically worked like 4th edition healing surges or 5th edition fighters' second winds. Your character sheet told you how many recoveries you had and how much health they recovered when used. In combat, they cost an action to use, but you can use however many you want outside of combat. In my opinion, they worked pretty well, as they gave me the impression that I could reasonably go a whole campaign without needing to have a cleric or a heal bot in my party. They also felt very heroic. You can imagine Captain America being completely wrecked in the middle of a fight and taking a breather just to come back to the fray with renewed determination. As for kits, I'm gonna make an editorial decision and talk about how they work now with a power roll instead of how they worked before. Kits are essentially video game loadouts, each coming with a type of armor, a type of melee weapon, and a type of ranged weapon. In the new system, they add damage to the 3 categories of results of your power rolls. A kit with a sword, for example, might add 2 damage to your low rolls, your mid rolls, and your high rolls. A heavy weapon, on the other hand, might add 0 to your low rolls, 0 to your mid rolls, and 5 to your high rolls. Kits can even add different values depending on whether you are attacking with a melee weapon or with a ranged weapon. I haven't played this yet, but it seems very nice and very flexible. I'm super excited to try it out on the second Patreon playtest. So thank you, Pao, for the question. And to anyone listening right now, make sure to leave a comment on YouTube if you have any other questions that you want me to answer. So that's it for today, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and the topic I chose for this time. Make sure to check out this episode's description for links to Goblin Points, Matt and James's Twitch accounts, Matt's YouTube channel, Matt's subreddit, MCDM's Patreon, MCDM's Discord, and my socials. See you all next time. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.